Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight for a review and question and answer session about the tragic avalanche accident that happened just over 2 weeks ago in Mill Creek Canyon. My name is Mark Staples. I'm the director of the Forest Service Utah Avalanche Center, and every avalanche accident is a tragic loss that seems to take people at the prime of their life. These accidents have a huge ripple effect across the entire community that seem to affect so many people. Let's please not forget about Kevin Studerman and Kurt Damschroeder, who died in two separate avalanches earlier this winter in January along the Park City Ridgeline. Regarding this avalanche that we'll discuss tonight, I'd like to thank my entire staff who worked overtime to produce a detailed and thorough report that we can all use looking forward. In fact, Paige and Toby up in Logan are just today at the site of another avalanche fatality just north of Logan, and we'll be working on that report as well. More importantly, I'd like to thank all the agencies and other organizations that were involved. And even more important than that are the survivors and the friends and family of the victims who have provided us with key details that really help fill out the story so that we can all learn from it. And our goal in these reports and our goal for the discussion tonight is not to place blame or find fault. Obviously, anytime there's an avalanche, mistakes were made. But our goal is to help the friends and the family of the victims understand what happened. Our goal is to make these tragic events learning opportunities for the rest of us. And personally, I can say that I've been to many fatal avalanches. I've spoken with the survivors and the friends and the family of the victims. I carry their names and their stories with me every day in the backcountry, and I'm safer for it. I hope we can all do the same tonight, learn a little bit, remember this accident so that we can all have many great days in the mountains ahead and return home safely to our families and friends. So thanks for joining us, and with that, I'll turn it over to Chad.
The panel is going to be led by Drew Hardesty, our forecaster based out of Salt Lake City here. And on the panel will be Trent Meisenheimer, also one of our forecasters from Salt Lake City, Nikki Champion, a forecaster here, as well as Dave Richards, who is the director of the Alta Avalanche Office, part of Wasatch Backcountry Rescue, and he was part of the investigation team out there in the field for this accident. And with that, I will turn this over to Drew, and we'll kick it off.
Thanks so much, Mark and Chad, and thanks and welcome to everyone watching here tonight. I also would like to give a special welcome to those involved in the Wilson tragic accident, and also the friends and family of those involved as well. There were many people involved in this rescue and recovery. We all know it's been a very dangerous season for avalanches in the backcountry. By my count, we're up to 32 for the year, and 25 since February 1st. We also just learned about a tragic accident, a fatality in Grand Teton National Park from today as well. So just a quick roadmap of what tonight looks like. We're going to start off reviewing the accident. Then we're going to review the investigation. We're going to go right into Q&A because we want this to be very much a give and take and a community effort as well. After that, we'll highlight some of our own key takeaways and key points. And then we'll just sort of wrap things up. We are planning to go until about 8 o'clock. But we'll just sort of see how things go. So again, thanks for joining us. And with that, why don't we just jump right into and review the incident from the outset. Take it away.
Thanks, Drew. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Yeah, so I want to start with a recap of Group A, which, if you remember reading the report, Group A is Chris, it is Sarah, Steve, and Lewis Thomas. So it's a group of 5. And they began in Big Cottonwood Canyon early in the morning. They left their cars from Butler Fork, and they ascended up between Soldier Peak and Wilson through a small subridge, kind of on a southerly aspect. And along the way, they noted that the Wilson chutes had avalanched, and not a small avalanche. They took a really nice photo. They sent it to the UAC, which is what we love to see. As they climbed a little bit higher, they also took note of a very large and well-connected avalanche in Alexander Basin, which from the top of Wilson Peak, you can easily see most of that drainage. Again, sending that photo in to the UAC or tagging us in Instagram, and Drew Hardesty reposted that. I want to say it was about a little after 8 o'clock in the morning. They got to the summit, and it sounds like Chris and Sarah, by large, were mostly the ones that came up with the idea for skiing the Wilson Glades. And it was agreed upon from the group, from the car, that they would ski there. Once they were on the peak, there wasn't a lot of discussion of whether or not they should ski it. The discussion really revolved about how are we going to ski it. They were well aware that there was a slight breakover or rollover in the glades, but they thought, given the terrain and given the way they could manage it, that they could do so safely. By and large, I'm skipping quite a few details here, so I'd encourage you, if you haven't read the report, please read the report in detail. And again, I've only got a couple of minutes to speak towards the way Group A made their decisions, so I am skipping some details here. But anyway, Group A dropped in, they skied one at a time, all down to the bottom, and regrouped and made their way for a second run. They broke trail on up back to the ridge, skied a second lap, transitioned once again, worked their way up to the ridge, and one group member named Steve decided that he was tired and decided to wait up on the ridge line while the other 4 group members took their next lap down the slope. Down they went. All 4 made it just fine. They transitioned once again for their final climb out of the Wilson Glade. Now I'll kind of turn it over to Nikki to help us bring us to where Group B was at this time.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Group B that morning. And Group B was made up of Nate, Ethan, and Steph. So Group B approached from the Mill Creek Canyon side. They started around 8:30 in the morning from the winter gate at the end of the Mill Creek Canyon Road and approached the road on skins until they hit the Alexander Basin trailhead. It's about 3 miles up. Once they hit the Alexander Basin trailhead, they began breaking a trail uphill towards the Wilson Glades drainage from that trailhead. It's just east of the Alexander Basin trailhead. On their way up, they did see several natural avalanches in Alexander Basin, probably the same naturals noted by Group A. And they discussed the avalanche danger. All of Group B was aware of the high avalanche danger that day. They had discussed it in the morning and on the tour. Group B, they were aware that Wilson Glades could avalanche, and their general plan for the entire day was to avoid avalanche terrain. Their specific plan was to ascend to the Wilson Glades, get some eyes on the slope before it got steeper, and then discuss a plan on where to go and what to ski, and if to continue into some of the steeper slopes above. Ethan and Steph were familiar with the area. It was Nate's first time in the area. He had just moved. Both groups made observations of that recent avalanche activity. Group B did not dig a pit that day, and I don't believe Group A did as well. Once Group B reached the bottom of the Wilson Glades, they saw the tracks from the previous group. They didn't know if there was any other parties traveling, but they did see tracks on the slope. and they saw a skin track heading uphill. Once they saw the skin track, they stopped breaking trail and they joined that skin track. Nate and Ethan were a bit ahead of Steph, and they reached a point that they could see the steeper part of the Wilson Glade. They waited in that opening for Steph to get to them so that they could discuss if they wanted to continue uphill or if that was going to be their high point for the day.
And so at this point, Group A, which was only 4 people because Steve was still up on the ridge waiting for his group to come up, as they ascended the slope all on skins, they decided to regroup at a pretty large tree, an old growth tree, just below the last rollover. And they were going to ascend one at a time to the low angle spot on the ridge line so they could very much keep an eye on each other and cross this spot one at a time. They also crossed this slope one at a time, the 2 previous runs. And in total, there was 14 tracks on the slope, as well as an up track that had been traveled on their 3rd time. When the avalanche happened, Chris and all members of Group A were very unaware that Group B was below. Either party had not seen each other for that day. But when the avalanche happened, Chris described it as he thought an earthquake had happened. It was a very audible and booming collapse noise that I'm sure he'll never forget. Within seconds, their party was swept away downhill. Chris was able to lunge for the big tree. And somehow he was able to grab that tree and hang on for dear life. When the avalanche washed by, Chris found himself a couple feet off the ground, still clinging in that tree. His skis were washed away, both skis were gone, and he jumped out of that tree down onto the bed surface. From there, Chris yelled to the remaining 1 partner up on the ridge line, Steve. I'm unsure at this point if they made initial contact right off the bat, but it was pretty quick that Steve heard Chris's shouting. But Chris immediately went downhill, turned his beacon over to search, and got a signal. Followed that signal in, did a grid search, probe strike, and the first person he came to was Nathan. And much to his surprise, he was, I'm sure, kind of like, "Who are you?" Because at this point, they had no idea there was another group below them. It was a pretty amazing dig. I was there personally. I stood in the hole. The hole was 4 to 6 feet deep, about the size of a hot tub. Lots and lots of snow needed to be removed. But anyway, they got to his airway. Steve at some point came down and helped at this point, started digging Nate out of the snow. He was unconscious, but quickly came to. And they dug down to about his chest, turned his beacon off, and said, "Get your shovel out and get ready to start rescuing." Right after that, they turned the beacon off, like I said, got another signal very close, and started digging down and got to Ethan. Ethan was buried roughly arm's width from Nate in the same hole, 4 to 6 feet deep. When they got to Nate, he was unconscious but breathing on his own. They dug down to about his belly button and turned off his beacon and left him there. And Nate, Steve, and Chris began searching once again for for the other people. Chris had to do a little bit of a circular pattern outside of the hole trying to pick up the next signal. And I can't remember exactly, but I think his next signal was 40 meters. And it was basically to the east at about the same elevation. And as they pinpointed in on that location and got a probe strike, they dug down and quickly realized that it was Sarah, Chris's significant other. She was buried 1 to 2 feet deep, so fairly shallow in comparison to the other victims. They dug down and performed CPR and rescue breaths, while Chris stayed with Sarah and continued resuscitation. Nate and Steve, moved on to the next beacon. They turned Sarah's beacon off and moved on downhill. And I believe the next person they came to was Thomas sometime later. He was a little deeper, maybe 3 to 4 feet deep, found unconscious, not breathing, and there was no resuscitation efforts made on him. They turned his beacon off and went on once again to the next victim, which was Lewis, and they dug down again 3 to 4 feet deep and found Lewis not breathing, and no resuscitation efforts were made. Somewhere in between this, and it gets a little bit fuzzy, is Nate came back and forth to Ethan. Now, if you remember, Ethan was the second person dug out, and he had only been dug out about halfway, and he was unconscious, and he was going in and out of hypothermia and distress and in a lot of pain. So a lot of times through this rescue, he was screaming and yelling for help. By and large, the rescuers ignored him for the most part, but came back to aid him when they could. And Nate came and gave him, warm clothing and food and water, and tended to him as needed. The final person dug out, and I'm not really sure of the timeline, was Steph. She was downhill of everybody about 100 vertical feet further than the rest of them. And she was buried roughly 4 to 6 feet deep, feet downhill, head uphill. And when they got to her, once again, not breathing or responsive, and no resuscitation efforts were made. If we rewind a little bit, Chris did dial 911 when he first got to Nate. So when the avalanche really first happened, he dug down, got to Nate, and realized, wow, there's a lot of people missing here. He dialed 911, gave him the details that I'm at Wilson Glade. There's been an avalanche. We need help. And by and large, he hung up the phone. He did not spend much time on the phone. 911 did try to call him back 15 to 20 times, but Chris did not pick up the phone, as he very much was interested in trying to save other people's lives. At this point, the world and 911 started to be notified that there was a major accident involved. And I'll kick it over to Dave to talk to us a little bit about some of the organization rescue and for both operational periods.
Thanks, Trent. So, like Trent just mentioned, at around 11:40 a.m. on the 6th, there was a 911 call to Valley Emergency Center, or Valley Emergency Communications, reporting an avalanche in the Wilson Glades area. And it was listed as a hang up because not all the information was gathered. And obviously, Chris was very much occupied doing other things at the time, trying to save lives of people on the slope. The position of the cell phone call was triangulated, and the information that had been gathered was sent out to the UPD canyon sergeants. etc. UPD is in charge of backcountry rescue and search and rescue within the Salt Lake County area. Rough and very incomplete information started going out to Wasatch Backcountry Rescue members and Salt Lake County Search and Rescue around 11:45. There's perhaps an avalanche involving up to 8 people in the Wilson Glades area. And then by 11:50, things were in full motion and helicopters were dispatched literally from across the state to start picking up rescuers and try and get in there as quickly as people could. The first rescuer that was airlifted in was Max McNeil from Brighton. And I quickly followed him on another aircraft coming out of Alta. And at this point, the two of us were circling over the accident scene at around 12:15 p.m. And we're unfortunately faced with a decision that we don't really have anywhere to land here. And we were able to see what was going on the ground. At this point, we were able to see digging in progress, and Max was able to report that he saw CPR in progress from the air. The decision was made that we couldn't land there. We attempted a landing, or Max attempted a landing over on top of Anchors Away on the other side of Wilson Peak, which would have given us access to the snow, but it was deemed unsafe due to the travel underneath the hang fire from the Wilson Chutes avalanche that would have been necessary to put us on scene. So a decision was made that we couldn't land. At this point, there were 3 rotorcraft in the air trying to get in, and everyone was forced to pull back and rig for hoist. And helicopters were rigged for hoist, and went back in, and we were able to place Max on the snow just to the north and east of the toe of the debris. And then he was rapidly followed by Ryan from Salt Lake County Search and Rescue, again in the same drop off just to the northeast of the toe. They were able to make, get communication with the survivors on scene. And at this point, we were able to actually put together a full picture of what had happened, and that we had 4 survivors and 4 deceased on scene. That was very, very confusing, with the number being the same for all of us just listening to radios and garbled cell phone calls. It was very confusing. 4 alive, 4 deceased. We didn't know quite what was going on until Ryan and Max were able to actually touch point. The decision was made to get the 4 survivors off the scene, and based on daylight hours and the situation in front of us, as well as the knowledge that the 4 remaining people were in fact deceased, beacons were turned back on and the deceased individuals were left for the night. Which is always a hard decision to make for everyone out there listening. You don't want to leave people in the mountains, but sometimes you have to do that. The next morning at 7 a.m., everyone gathered again at the end of the paved road in Mill Creek Canyon. Again, Ryan and Max were lifted in via hoist, along with 2 other rescuers. And those of us from the UAC Accident Investigation Team followed. We all met up on scene, reassessed the situation for safety, etc. And the short story is perform the accident investigation and then move to extricate the bodies to a place where they could be hoisted off the snow via the Department of Public Safety helicopter and brought down and out of the hills. I'll tell you, from a professional rescuer standpoint, very, very confusing situation. Borderline overwhelming situation, just based on the numbers involved. And beyond that, I'm happy to answer any questions on that part of it.
Nikki, go ahead and review what we learned about the avalanche proper, as well as the terrain, sort of describing the Wilson Glade area.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I'm going to share my screen and show some images for people who just aren't necessarily familiar with the Wilson Glade area. So. Sweet. All right, so a little bit about the Wilson Glades. It's a north-facing slope, about 500 vertical foot run. It's in the Mill Creek Canyon area, just below the summit of Wilson Peak that we keep talking about. That runs along the ridgeline that separates Big Cottonwood from Mill Creek Canyon, which is why both parties were able to approach the run from different canyons. The map is marked with an X that shows the approximate location of the avalanche debris. This is a map represented from the Wasatch Backcountry Skiing map. Here I've pulled up the same map on CalTopo with a slope overlay. You can see the slight difference in slope angle and shading dependent on the map source, but the avalanche occurred on a northeast facing slope at 9,600 feet. The slope angle that we measured on the crown profile was recorded at 31 degrees. Most of the ski tracks from Group A were primarily found on the part of the slope where it was 31 degrees. A following day, a group went out and recorded slope angles all over the Wilson Glade slope, so we were able to get a better picture of the Wilson Glade area in general. But the uphill skin track that was used was to lookers left of this photo, kind of following the dense trees a bit out of the site, but kind of the periphery, lookers left, where the slopes touch steeper. You can see that 33 to 40 to 37 degree area. A bit more kind of the whole slope and the terrain laid out. The route Group B took coming in from the Mill Creek Road to Alexander Basin up to Wilson Glade is about 2,200 feet vertical climb, mainly along the summer trail, and then through low-angled aspen trees until you reach the glade proper. So the bottom box is where you kind of reach that glade proper and you start to enter those more dense trees. And then where it begins to kind of pick up in slope steepness. Just below the slope steepness where it enters that 30 to 40 degree area, you can see that 23, 25 degree area, is where Group B planned to regroup and discuss their route. At the time of the avalanche, Group B was standing on a 25 degree slope, as you can see right around here.
So the next morning, Dave briefly touched on the investigation, but myself, Dave Richards, Nikki Champion, Greg Gagney, Cody Hughes from the Utah Avalanche Center side, which was going to go up and investigate the actual avalanche, met in Mill Creek Canyon for an 0730 debrief by Salt Lake County Search and Rescue. DPS helicopter was scheduled to land about that same time, and everybody would regroup and come up with a plan. As Dave said, they flew 4 people in total. So it was Max McNeil, Ryan, and forgive me, but I forget the other 2 that went in on scene. After the first helicopter left, Search and Rescue decided to give us a snowmobile bump up the road, and we would head in by foot from the Alexander Basin trailhead and on up into the Wilson Glades to perform our investigation. Now, the way that the Utah Avalanche Center really does avalanche investigations, we're very much concerned with the details and what happened. So how steep was the slope? Where were the people? Who was caught? Who was carried? Where did they end up? What is the aspect? What is the elevation? We need to do a crown profile. So we need to go up and look at the crown if we can safely. There's been many accidents I've been to that I've never been able to make it to the crown. And in that case, we'll try to dig a representative, snow pit profile. But that was very much our business there that morning. Typically, this is the third accident I've been to this season, and I typically would really like to be there once search and rescue has kind of completed their extraction. But given the nature of the complex terrain and the trees, we showed up on scene and not much had happened. So there's a little bit of an interesting perspective there, but most of us were focused on our job. We wanted to get the details, and we began our investigation that morning. I'd say we showed up at about 10:30 in the morning. So yeah, Drew, I'll kick it back over to you.
Yeah, Dave, there's something that I want you to tease apart. Our last point here before we go to Q&A is sort of looking at the decision-making of those involved. And without question, there are always mistakes made when there's an avalanche involvement. And there sometimes can be pitfalls and traps that the investigators or the general public can make when sort of viewing the decisions for those on the scene. Dave, take a minute and sort of talk about how do we avoid hindsight? What are some ways in looking at conducting an investigation from that decision-making perspective?
Well, hindsight is almost impossible. I think we can all agree to that. We've all done something in our lives where we look back and say, boy, that was a bad decision. And yes, you're right. When accidents occur, there is a mistake that was made, but there's always a reason why that mistake was made. And our job is not to say, well, geez, we should have just done that. Our job is to say, how did we get here? And I always use the words we, because it's important that we put ourselves in the boots of the people involved here, because we weren't actually there, they were. So we have to make ourselves part of this group and say, where did we make this mistake? What led us to make that mistake? What led us to make the mistake of going to that first mistake? I mean, these things happen in a series. And so where did we go wrong? Did we go wrong all the way back at the Butler Fork Trailhead with a specific goal in mind? Did we go wrong when we looked at an avalanche and didn't correlate it to the same slope and angle and terrain and aspect that we were just about to ski? Did we go wrong? There's a whole list of where, and what the mistake actually was. And the only way we can actually get to that answer is by being completely fair to both ourselves and the party on scene, and putting ourselves in their shoes without judgment and saying, can I understand how we got here? And if we can understand how we got there as a group, then now we can start to understand what the mistake was, what led up to that, and what we can do to prevent it in the future.
Yeah, Dave, spot on. I would say that many people have come to me and they say, wow, this is really humbling, because I could have seen myself in either of those parties. Let's jump right into some Q&A. And part of the background research is sort of looking at what led to this is a bit of the weather and the snowpack history. Nikki, maybe take a minute and sort of talk about what is it about the snowpack this year in Utah in particular, and sort of around the West, like what's going on when we're describing that things are particularly tricky? Give us an idea of what's going on here.
Yeah, so all season long, it seems we've been talking about this weak faceted layer of snow that formed during the periods of cold, dry weather in November and December. Following those cold periods, these really weak faceted grains formed, and they're kind of making up the entire base of our entire, in the entire central Wasatch, the entire west, kind of everybody's seeing this really weak faceted snow at the ground or right above the ground. After these dry periods, we finally did start to get some storm systems. 2 storms the week prior to the accident brought about 1.8 inches of water to the area, overloading that weak faceted snow that we'd been talking about the whole season. We'd kind of been waiting for a tipping point. So once we added these larger storms, these larger water totals, we reached that tipping point that made this really weak faceted snow so sensitive. It's allowing things to be really connected, really persistent. It's not showing signs of healing, and it wasn't showing signs of healing during the time of this accident.
And so to speak to that, Nikki, I mean, describe your own. I mean, we as a staff have talked about this quite a bit the last few weeks, but how are you adjusting your own decision-making and terrain choices sort of in response to this?
Yeah, this season I haven't stepped into avalanche terrain at all. We're touring in kind of unfamiliar patterns than we're used to. We're staying completely out and from underneath any avalanche terrain and run out zones. This weak layer is kind of representing itself in a different way. It's not showing you its obvious signs of instability. We're seeing cracking and collapsing directly following a storm, but sometimes even the day after, you may not see that obvious cracking and collapsing, and it's allowing you to get a lot farther out onto the slope than previous and avalanching from above. We're still seeing avalanches being triggered from a distance. So we've really all stepped back, I think, for the entire season as a forecasting staff. All of us are not even comfortable traveling under terrain that we would usually use to approach some lower angle terrain.
Let's put the microscope on the Wilson Glades proper. But, you know, in the investigation, we outlined just recent history, just talking with quote some old timers, and they have also had some scrapes in the Wilson Glades. Trent, you know, you having been in there before for field days in the past, and then also in particularly going up and you know, really putting a microscope on the Wilson Glade. What is it about that terrain that you think draws people into it during areas of considerable to high danger?
Ooh, good question. There's a lot to unpack there, Drew. But you know, the Wilson Glades, it feels friendly, especially if you're on skis or a board from the top, right? Like I've actually never approached it from the bottom, which I did the day of the accident. Most of the time I use it as a way to exit out of, say, a tour for the day. And from the top, it just, yeah, there's a rollover there. And yeah, it's kind of steep, but like there's a lot of trees, and it feels generally friendly. You know, it's much different than, say, being on God's lawnmower in Kessler, where it just feels like overwhelmingly big and there's this huge avalanche path. But unfortunately, you know, avalanches really don't care about the size of the terrain. It all comes down to slope angle. And by and large, what we found out is that this is avalanche terrain. It does break to greater than 30 degrees, and therefore you are in avalanche terrain. But I do get it that it just by and large doesn't feel big and ominous and scary. And so I think a lot of us can make that choice of, hey, this place feels like pretty good. But remember, it all comes down to gravity. It comes down to slope angle. And that's what the avalanche cares about, not how we feel, but what is the angle of those slopes. And unfortunately, again, with the Wilson path, it's pretty nasty. I mean, it drains. The runout zone is just straight into thick trees. So there's not a lot of places to like run and hide in there. You know, you kind of just get swept right into the trees, and And that's kind of the nature of that path.
I would say that many of us here tonight have never seen the Wilson Glade run wall to wall like that. I mean, I have argued in the past that we just don't, in terms of like pattern recognition, we just don't have that hard drive that is as complete as we might want it to be, or we think it would be. And I guess to speak to that and to the number of folks tuning in tonight, I know that each of you has your own sort of go-to spot when it's maybe considerable danger, or there's a PWL or a high danger or something of that nature. But I guess I would, in that way, encourage you to challenge your own assumptions of what you've seen and what you've trusted. And the classic thing is, I have never seen that slope slide before. But just maybe take that microscope, that magnifying lens back to some of your own go-to terrain, and maybe challenge some of those assumptions in that way. We've had a number of questions regarding the up track. When I first went over to start talking to those involved, the initial report was that someone had been skiing down on top of everyone else, but that was not the case at all. So the question being, Dave, maybe I would have you take a stab at this, sort of talk about sort of the inherent perils of the skin track and how we might be more vulnerable than we might expect, and some tips and tricks in terms of being on the up track.
Well, I think that we're all guilty of preaching this whole ski one at a time, ski one at a time, ski one at a time thing. And that's a really good lesson, but we never say skin one at a time. I mean, and I think we mean skin one at a time. I think we mean only expose one person at a time, but we always attach the word ski to it for some reason. And as much as I love walking along in the woods and having a skin track conversation with somebody, I think one of the great take homes is, and this drives a lot of people nuts when I say this, but skiing is not a social sport. You shouldn't be anywhere close to each other to have this conversation unless you're on a nice, soft, pointed ridgeline. A skin track should be lonely, lonely, lonely thinking time, just like a ski run should be all by yourself. And I think we need to really drive that back into ourselves as skiers, that when we're skinning, we're just as exposed as we are when we're skiing. Time for conversation is at the bottom before we expose ourselves, and at the top once we all regroup at the top. And then the other thing that we, always have to keep in mind, and it came up talking to some of the old guys after this event, is where those skin tracks go. The old timer skin tracks in the Wasatch went where they went for reasons. And I'm not going to second guess where current day skin tracks go. There are some that I'll follow and some that I won't. But we have to think about our exposure when we place those skin tracks, even more so than we do when we are dropping in to ski the run. Because when you're on your skins and you can't get out of your skis and these tech bindings that are locked in, or split board bindings, and skins don't slide very well going downhill, we all know that, especially with the free heel, you're very, very, very helpless. I don't know how many people remember when Craig Patterson, the UDOT forecaster, was killed on an up track. You cannot escape when you're in walk mode, the skin's on. There's no getting away. So we have to put extra thought into our skin track placement and our exposure when we're doing it. Does that answer your question, Drew?
Yeah, that's right on. We find it challenging to be able to to spread out and go one at a time, as it were. And so I think that this really hits upon these ideas of the up track must be safe, sort of thing. Mark Staples and Evelyn Lees have looked at some accidents and numbers, and from 2009 to 2017, they found that just under a third of avalanche fatalities occurred. Those people were on the up track. And this year alone, getting towards 40% of people were on the up track just this year alone. So that's pretty significant in that way. We have a question about just sort of the bindings. Many of these were deeper burials. Were people still buried deeply with their toe pieces still locked in? What can anyone speak to that? What are some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Ethan was pinned with his skis. It was actually very confusing because the skis were still in the hole, but there were no skins on them. So I thought, oh, for sure this person had been in, the act of skiing, not skinning. All the skins had been ripped off, but he was in fact pinned with his feet in his skis. Also, Thomas, both of his skis were still attached to his feet. I can't speak to Sarah or Lewis. To the best of my knowledge, Chris was the only person that was actually able to get out of his skis, and that's as he grabbed the tree and somehow the avalanche washed by and ripped them off. But we did find both of his skis on slope. So I think everyone else is basically pinned by their skis. Those things are anchors.
Any perspective, Trent, Nikki, on sort of changing the way you might have your toe piece locked or not? You just sort of have it downhill and in ski mode on the up track. Are there any thoughts to that?
Yeah, Drew. Actually, just 2 days ago, I decided I'm not gonna pull my toe. I left the car. And I'm like, I'm not going to pull the toe piece to lock mode, and let's just see how it goes. And actually just stepping into my skis, I got one foot in, and when I was trying to put my other foot in, I fell flat to my face. I think a couple of my friends were like, whoa, what's wrong with you? And I tried walking. I gave it another go, and every kick turn, I would just pop out. So to me, it's unfortunate. Maybe in the future, some binding manufacturers will come up with maybe a half click or something that we're not fully clicked in. But at least for me, my bindings, I need to lock them in order for them to work pretty well for me. I think the take home point is our up tracks need to be out of avalanche terrain. So anywhere the slope is steeper than 30 degrees, you need to realize you're in avalanche terrain. If we're going to make a conscious decision to walk into that terrain, it should be one at a time. I mean, I get it, right? You can't get to Coal Pit without going up the needle here. I like skiing avalanche terrain as much as the next person, but I do think you need to be aware that once you lock those toe pieces, you're taking on a much bigger risk in avalanche terrain. I'm not really sure. I can't speak to all the different binding manufacturers out there, but it is a significant risk.
Trent, I'm glad that you hit upon that. I think, one's like the big picture and the other one seems to be like the little picture, as it were. Once again, I think the big picture you hit upon is just where the up tracks need to be. Nikki, one getting back to the snowpack, a question came in is sort of twofold, and maybe have at both of them. One is, this idea that, well, Wilson Glade has avalanched, and it avalanched down to the old facets and depth hoard near the ground. But what's a repeater, and can it avalanche again? And then sort of part B of that is, are we out of the woods, or like, what's it going to take for us to get out of the woods, for not being with such a dicey sort of snowpack? Maybe take a stab at one or both of those.
Yeah, so with this avalanche, it did break about 40 centimeters above the ground. And almost all the avalanches that we've been seeing throughout this whole season have been breaking about 20 to 40 centimeters above the ground and leaving that weak faceted snow. There's been a couple areas that it does step down to the dirt, but almost all the avalanches are leaving all of that weak faceted snow. So that weak layer isn't going anywhere. So that weak layer that we keep talking about, it's still there in Wilson Glade, and it will be a repeater slope because it does still have that layer of concern. For that same reason, we're not out of the woods, and actually kind of the opposite. Those are going to be the areas that now have a shallower snowpack, unlike, the central cottonwoods that could have 2 meters of snow now sitting on this 30 centimeters of weak faceted snow. Somewhere like the Wilson Glade, it could only have like a meter of snow now. So it's going to be a shallower area, potentially easier to trigger, and definitely not out of the woods yet.
Yeah, Nikki, I think when we did the ground profile, we noted 10 inches or so of snow still left. Like the avalanche, right, broke. And then beneath that, there was, 10 inches of still mature depth ore underneath that bed surface.
Yeah, there's like a decomposing crust that we've seen throughout with facets completely below it and completely on top of it. So just a facet sandwich and still lingering on the entire slope.
Dave, speak to the number of airbags that were involved out there that day.
Well, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong and some new information has come to light, but there were none based on all of our interviews and investigation. No airbags were on anybody's person. And, you can't prove a negative, Drew, so I can't tell you if it would have made any difference. These are thick trees, and this avalanche wasn't horribly fast moving based on my assessment of the flagging in the trees and things like that. This thing never really got up to speed. And airbags, I'm not a physicist and I won't get too far into this, but they really need turbulent flow in order to function properly. I'm not sure it would have made much difference. So, but the answer, what we do know is there were none there and none were deployed. So that's all I can really tell you. I'm going to stick to what I know.
Getting to that turbulent flow, Dave, just speak in broad terms. Which group might have benefited most from the airbag? The group A at the top, group B at the bottom, both, neither. Just in general terms, what we think we know about turbulent flow and avalanche airbags.
So group B at the bottom was basically overrun by relatively slow moving snow and basically pushed over. And based on interviews with Nate, they think they only moved, we'll say they moved a very short distance at a very slow rate of speed. They were just pushed over. I don't think an airbag would have actually been able to rise to the top of that flow. Group A at the top of the slope, moving faster and further downhill. Airbag may have made a difference. Again, they went into a very thick stand of trees, like Trent mentioned. And whether it would have made a difference or not, perhaps in one of those burials, it may have made a difference. In the other two, I'm not sure. And I would be remiss to hypothesize on that. You can't prove a negative, and I have no way of jumping to any sort of conclusion on that.
Trent, speak to what we know in general terms about I mean, what has so many of us scratching our heads is, I mean, by and large, we're accustomed to, okay, so, we all get to the top of the slope, or we're all at the base of the slope. Regardless, it's like, well, okay, the first person rides down, they trigger the avalanche, and that's that. But talk a bit more about what we know of the structure or fracture mechanics. I mean, they'd already skied the Wilson Glade 3 times, and we're on their third up track, with an additional party down at the base of the run. I mean, how do we best understand that?
Yeah, so the easiest way to think about it is, like Nikki described, back in November, December, and even through most of January, you got to remember this weak layer was stretched across all shady terrain, period. Maybe the only aspect that didn't see faceted snow was due south. And I can say for certain, because I've traveled on plenty of southwest and southeast, that I've seen faceted snow. And I've seen plenty of faceted snow on the northerly facing slopes, which are the shady aspects. So if you picture just faceted snow, a uniform layer, not just right off the ground, but a foot or two deep, right? So it's going to break up little rocks and little features, right? It's gonna make the slope look white. Then we start adding the slab. And over time, the slab, it gets a little snow, it settles, it gets a little thicker. We add a little bit more snow, it settles, it gets thicker or stronger. So that's basically our setup. I think from our snow pit, we had about a meter of snow sitting on top of weak snow. So 3.5 feet of snow on top of facets. Now, the other thing I know about avalanches is you need two things. You need to be able to initiate. Initiate is just a fancy word for, say, trigger. So what have you. You got to be able to put a force onto the snowpack to collapse it. And then we need to propagate. And if we have initiation and propagation, it really doesn't matter, like distance and all these things that we think in our mind, it doesn't matter. If the slope is steep enough, so say greater than 30 degrees, that's where the snow will break away from that slope. Am I getting at your question here, Drew? I think unfortunately this slope was very well connected with a uniform weak layer. We added a stiff or a strong slab on top of it. And what we know about persistent weak layers is it really doesn't matter. Like there can be tracks all over the slope, and it just takes one person to find, who knows who triggered this avalanche. It could have very well been Group B at the bottom, or it could have been Group A at the top. I literally can't tell you that information. All I know is that where the slab is a little bit weaker or a little bit thinner, you tickle that weak layer and you get the propagation to go, then all bets are off. That's when the avalanche happens.
Yes, it speaks to just the numbers that 70%, just over 70% of our avalanche fatalities, those avalanches are dealing with persistent weak layers, whether it's what we call a persistent slab or a deep slab avalanche, that there's facets, depth hoar, surface hoar involved. And I think it sort of speaks to that, to take a couple steps back, if that's the structure. We are running out of time, but I would very much be keen for, Trent, Nikki, Dave. Dave, we'll start with you. What's a takeaway for you, for folks to leave home with this evening, from maybe this incident, but something that would be practical for them, or mindset, for the rest of the winter?
I think there's sorry, Chad, I'm going to take an extra second here, but there's two things going on here. There's an avalanche problem, right? We have a persistent weak layer that the Wasatch is not used to dealing with this late into the year. And then we have a people problem. And if we can keep the two separate, then we don't have a problem. If we mix the two, which is a whole bunch of us that are frothing to go skiing and moving way too fast in a time of serious stress, and we then put ourselves into the lair of the avalanche problem. Now we're having conversations like we are tonight. And I can't fix the avalanche problem. Nobody can. We can dig holes in it all day long and it won't go away till it melts. But we can't fix the people problem. So we need to step back and we need to look at ourselves as humans and look at our emotions and say, this is the only thing that's going to fix this year, is tempering our emotions and stepping way back. And I'd encourage people to read up on avalanche mindset. Nikki mentioned stepping back, which is one mindset in professional avalanche mindset, versus stepping out. And I would tell you, we're actually in a thing called entrenchment, which is we are basically hiding under the bed, and we need to go back and hide under the bed for a long time and ski low angle snow and just enjoy that and write off the big stuff for the foreseeable future. And entrenchment takes a lot of wherewithal and dedication to stick to, because I want to go ski powder too, but we're entrenched. We're dealing with a different problem that none of us are really used to in the Wasatch for this long a period of time. And it's going to take some serious discipline to just stay entrenched and hide on the low angle slopes and move very, very, very slowly if and when the time comes to step out. And that's really my only takeaway, is we have to slow down. We have got to slow down. When we see photos or when we see avalanches that we think are important enough that we should tag the UAC in them, we need to translate that information to what we're about to ski and take Nikki's stepping back one step further and just focus on going home. Easier said than done.
Thanks, Dave. Nikki, what are some of your takeaways from tonight and for the rest of the season?
Yeah, that's a tough one. There's a few, and I think taking everything from this event and everything from the season and trying to stack your odds in your favor. So using events like this to check your own personal risk tolerance and, challenge the assumptions and things you could, put yourself in that situation. But when you do go into the field, use the information that we learned from this accident to stack the odds in your favor, making sure that when you're traveling downhill, your toes are always unlocked. We know those things work as anchors, making sure that we're checking our wrist straps, actually putting our skin track in safe, non-avalanche terrain with nothing above or below you. Space, like learning, using the situation to learn and stack the odds in your favor. And this isn't a problem that we're going to be able to thread the needle. So avoidance is going to be key for this problem, and continuing to avoid the terrain and really checking what's actually above and connected to you. Looking at all terrain, looking at your assumed safe paths and rechecking them and rechecking the slope angles, and not falling into old habits and kind of gaining new habits out of this.
Nikki, thanks a lot. Trent, what are some of your take homes or sort of key points from this and for the rest of the season?
I've got 3 and I'll be quick. One is I would like to speak to Chris, and I hope he's listening tonight, but hopefully I can even say it, but I've been to a lot of accidents where the victim buried isn't rescued by their companions, whether it be 1, 2, or 3 people. Just too much time goes by. The simple fact is Chris, by and large by himself, possibly with some help from Steve, got to Nate, and not only Nate, but also Ethan. And there's 2 alive people today. I know it's really easy to focus on the fact that 4 people died, but we would have had 6 people dead. And the truth is we would have had 7 people dead had Chris been buried with the rest of them. I've dug a lot of holes in the mountains, not only just for snow pits, but the size of these holes and the effort that went into digging. Yeah, I don't know if I could hang, man. Like it is heavy. My second point, so I would say hats off to the rescuers. It was truly, we've used the word heroic many times, but it was, they were dealt a bad hand and they did a really good job given the circumstances. Brett Kobernick, sorry to single you out there, Brett, if you're on the line here, but he got caught in a pretty serious avalanche, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago down on the plateau. Faceted snowpack. Lucky to be alive. Broke his femur, ended up partially buried. You know, he told me that day, the night, I don't know, I talked to him a day or 2 later. He just straight up told me, Trent, don't mess with facets. Just don't mess with facets. I really took that to home, and I'd like everybody to listen tonight. I'm not out there outsmarting our avalanche problem. I'm not digging a hole and doing an ECT test and saying, oh, I got 20, ECTP 27, I could ski this rib. I am by and large just avoiding avalanche terrain. You can't outsmart faceted snow. So for me, call me conservative, I am. I'm 33 years old. I ski roughly 60 days a year in the winter. You multiply that over another 30-year career, because I got to get that government retirement job put in the bank. So I'll be 63 years old. That's a lot of right decisions. That's a lot of right decisions and a lot of right days. So for me, I have to simplify it. And if there's by and large faceted snow in our snowpack, I just take a step back. I'm with Nikki here. You know, I don't overthink it. I ride low angle terrain, and I try to avoid the stuff above and below me. So I guess that would be my message to the community is there's no secret here. The forecasters, the pros, the people that I talk to, we're all stepping back. There's no we're out there tagging lines and telling you to avoid this stuff.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Trent. Yeah, totally, 100%. I would say run sheets are a good planning tool to take a look at what our avalanche danger rose is and sort of apply that to terrain. And some terrain just may be off for the day. In fact, maybe some terrain may be off for the winter. And then look ahead at that and say, once again, even like, from your breakfast nook or something like that, as you're looking at the map, as you're looking at the danger rows and the danger across the board there, just imagine yourself in that terrain, and you would say in the communication, which is paramount with your group that day, you're saying, okay, well, we're hearing considerable or high avalanche danger. Convince me that we're not going to get avalanched. I mean, these are hard decisions and hard conversations to make, but they're key. And you can have these conversations before you even leave the house or before you even dive into that terrain. Convince yourself, how am I not going to get avalanched here? And these conversations are key because we know of what the consequences are that are at stake. The other thing too is, I hope many of you taking notes or listening here are coming away with like 1, 2, or 3 different bits of information from the past hour. Sometimes that, I'll be the first one to say, I mean, sometimes that gap between knowledge and application of same can be pretty wide. How will you know that you will apply some of these thoughts and lessons and tips into the rest of your season or the rest of your life? My last point here that I would like to acknowledge before we wrap up here is to say that for many of us, we've been talking about this incident and the snowpack in the West and in Utah in particular, and we're all coming away with, again, a few of these points to take home. And we're learning some of these lessons and ideas and how to apply this into our own lives. But for some of us, it's much more than that, because there's all these things for those that are involved, these different ideas of grief and shame and guilt, and how do we pick up the rest of our lives and move on. And these things are not apparent and don't have answers that come freely after we get off the computer here. But I just would like to say that we are here for you. We have a strong Avalanche community and Avalanche Center. We are here for you. This is our community. So for everyone here tonight, thanks so much for tuning in. We are so grateful for your support. Please have a safe rest of your winter. We'll see you out there. Thanks so much.